Hello and welcome back to Well That Aged Well. And this week I'm once again joined by Roger Chickering. And the last time he was on, we discussed Wilhelm II. And this week we are going to discuss his recent publishing that came out this year, The German Empire, which I'm trying to, sorry, but my virtual background is disrupting, but I'll try to hold up here. The German Empire, 1871 to 1918, which he was kind to send me a copy of. And I really enjoyed the book. And we're going to discuss this topics today, of course, and it should be essential reading if you are fascinated by the German Empire. And let's just talk about how this book came about, because it's kind of a survey book where you cover everything from, and we're going to talk about some of this in this episode, but you kind of cover everything from industry to rural and urban life in Germany to the religion and the government. So let's talk about a little bit how the idea behind this book came about.
Well, it's a long story.
I have
uh,
time.
I've been thinking about writing such a book for a half a century, and I found it intriguing, but I didn't feel that I was ready to write it. It is the kind of thing that would represent kind of an overview of a long career rather than something that one would jump into. So I retired 15 years ago and found myself suddenly with more time and also unable to travel as easily to the archives. So I decided that this was the time to try to write the book. And it underwent some some alterations even as I wrote it. I mean, it took me 15 years to write it, so my thinking obviously changed in the meantime on some of these things. Um, I gradually decided to move away from the idea of a completely open survey of uh, German history in the imperial era, and I tried to add some more thematic focus, which had particularly to do with this whole problem of domestic conflict, which I turned into the main plot line, sacrificing a lot of other stuff on the way that could have, if it were a more of a textbook kind of thing, it could have could have justified such things as there's very little in the way of the history of high culture, um, art, literature, and things like that. I don't spend much time with the university system except insofar as it was implicated in the history of domestic conflict in Imperial Germany. Actually, when I was writing the book, I decided that I was going to call it something like um, sectoral conflict and uh, sectoral conflict in a new nation state or something like that. And then when I sent it off to the press, they said to me, "Well, why don't we just call it the German Empire?" And I've
It's a much better title. I gotta be honest with you. It's a much better title.
Well, yeah, I've quarreled with them quite a bit in the course of my life, and I said, "Yeah, I think I see what you're talking about because to have a big, more, should we say, scholarly sounding title would certainly shift the likely appeal of the book to a different audience."
So let's begin with a little bit background of Germany from us. Let's start with the unification and how the unification process came about. And we made an episode called The Prussian Empire with J. Sheehan a while back, and where we're talking more about the German Empire itself, but we're going to talk, like we talked about much more in what the German Empire, how the German Empire actually functioned in this episode. But I would highly recommend checking out the episode we did with James J. Sheehan as well. But let's begin with a little bit about the unification process of the German Empire from, say, 1848 until 1871, because it took quite a while, this process.
Um, yeah, and it's a very complicated story, and it could be taken back for quite a while. It is probably best to start in the middle of the 19th century, when in the wake of revolutionary uprisings that took place everywhere in the German lands, uh, demands became increasingly loud, particularly from um, the liberal, commercial, and professional middle class, that the German states ought to be unified, which was in itself an extraordinarily complicated proposition insofar as there were lots of different projects for doing this. And the way it's usually told is that it played out as much as a Prussian conquest of Germany as it was a German unification. It came when the Prussian leadership concluded that it was in the state of Prussia's best interest to make sure that German unification, when it came on terms that were cordial to the interests of the Prussian state. And the man who is usually credited or blamed for the triumph of this calculation was Otto von Bismarck, who was the minister president of Prussia after 1862.
If I may, I'm curious to ask if was it only pr in Prussia that the idea of unification occurred, or did it say Bavaria or other principalities in Germany that they wanted some kind of unification? It was mainly in Prussia where the idea or originated in, as where we say we need to unify our Germany for once and for all, because there was kind of a, I wouldn't call it unification, but it was kind of, I don't know, compare this to the European Union in a way, because you had the North German Confederation, of course, from after Napoleon, but but it wasn't entirely unified as we know it. But was there other principalities that kind of wanted a unification as well, or was it mainly Prussia where the idea of unification came from?
No, you're perfectly right. There were factions of opinion uh, everywhere in Germany that were sympathetic to the idea of some kind of unification of the German states. And as I said, these were mostly people from the commercial and professional middle classes, as well as from within the bureaucracies of the various German states that did favor this outcome, just as there were lots of people who were not so happy about it. And I'm thinking particularly now of Catholics, because the prospect of a German unification under the auspices of a Prussian state or monarchy would certainly look to be an unattractive proposition as far as the Catholics were concerned. The reason this could not have happened, certainly in the way that it happened, were it not for the existence of an army that was powerful enough to win the wars that were necessary uh, to push this process along.
Hmm. So let's begin and talk about how I want. Let's go skip forward to 1870, of course, and where the real unification kind of, for lack of better words, actually happened. And let's talk about the early years of a unified Germany and how and what the national feeling of a unified Germany, how that occurred.
Well, the case that I'm arguing in this book is that the first decade or two of the new German Empire was absolutely critical for the subsequent history of the new state. And there was, admittedly, a great wave of nationalist euphoria in the country in the immediate aftermath of the unification, followed by an extraordinarily powerful economic economic, we say, wave of construction and business expansion, which lasted for 2 years before the stock market crashed and the recession set in. The case that I'm making is that the first decades of the new empire's existence were marked by a series of crises which I call them the seminal crises of the German Empire, which bred and exacerbated three different kinds of sectoral conflict that continued to plague the history of the new state for the entirety of its existence until 1918. And they were, in the first place, the decision by the liberal nationalists that they were going to have a final reckoning with the Catholic Church. They were going to turn it into a kind of uh, Protestantly administered state, subject to the same kinds of political supervision and oversight that the Protestant churches experienced in the new state. The second of these crises was the determination then of the new regime that they were going to have done once and for all with the Social Democrats, whom they portrayed as a threat to the existence of the new state. And finally, a growing rift between rural and urban Germany that reached a peak at the end of the century with a great crisis of agricultural prices. The result was that by the time the smoke had cleared by the turn of the 20th century, German society was badly rent on at least three dimensions, and they had thus to confront this problem for the rest of the existence of the state.
So now, of course, you mentioned religion, so let's go there as well because you dedicate a chapter to religion. Because, like as you mentioned, there is a lot of religion in the new Germany, and indeed some both Catholic and Protestant, and of course Judaism. And we will talk more about Judaism later, of course, as well. You have a chapter dedicated to Judaism. So let's talk a little bit about religion and how diverse the religion were and how this was handled in the New Germany. Of course, as you already said, the Prussians were very much Protestant and favorable to Protestants. But
Uh,
how did
there were lots of
yeah
Russian Catholics
yeah?
too.
So let's talk about how religion functioned in this new about against Judaism, Protestants, and Catholics as well as other religions. I'm sure that. So let's talk a little bit about faith in the new Germany.
Um, well, this is a long story too, and can be traced directly back to the 16th century, if not earlier than that. But it should suffice to say that the settlement in 1815 had set up um, a religiously divided German confederation in which the Catholic Church found itself having to confront political control from secular, which means to say from Protestant monarchies throughout the country. And there are all kinds of agreements um, that were made regulating Catholic affairs on much the same way that Protestant affairs had been regulated. Supervision of one sort or another, financial support from the state for Catholics as well as Protestant churches. And this was an arrangement that, compared to the 18th, 17th century, was distinctly to the disadvantage of Catholics. And what happened in the earlier part of the 19th century, beginning in the 1840s or thereabout, you find a remarkable rise in Catholic piety, popular Catholicism, demanding a return to Catholic rights and powers, um, also demanding the centralization of clerical power in Rome, pushed now after the middle of the century by the papacy itself, which then paradoxically in 1870 managed to legislate through the church's own councils the declaration of papal infallibility. This on the eve of the Franco-Prussian War, which was a slap across the face to liberal Protestants elsewhere in Germany. So once the war had ended, once the German Empire had been proclaimed, German liberals, with the Prussians in the forefront, decided that they were going to push it to a showdown with the Catholic Church.
If I may pause you for 1 second, because
Uh,
a lot of people today consider liberalism and conservative from a 21st century perspective. So what do you? But I believe it was quite different in the 19th. So talk a little bit about the difference for being a liberal and a conservative in the 19th century as to compare today, because a lot of people like to think that liberalism is today what we would call woke agenda in a way, but it's of course it's different in the 19th century. So let's talk. I want to actually take a little break and define what liberalism meant in the 19th century as well, especially from a German perspective.
yeah. Well, we we've had this conversation all in the United States as well. I used to tell my students, so shows you how far back it goes, that the most obvious case of an American liberal, by the terms understood in the 19th century, was Barry Goldwater, a man who was a devout believer in the free market, in what he called freedom, which is a minimal state interference in social life, so that the less government, the better. This was certainly a belief that was embraced by many people who called themselves, in fact, most people who called themselves liberals in Germany in the middle and the late 19th century. Now, along with this, particularly in the German case, went the conviction that the Catholic Church represented a residue of centuries old papal tyranny, a great threat, the greatest threat to human freedom, and that the way to take care of this problem was to subject the Catholic Church to the same kinds of supervision from the state that the Protestant churches had already established.
Mm. Now, the next thing I want to talk a little bit about, of course, is industrialization. And I believe, if I remember correctly, Peter Wilson as well talked about this in his book, Iron and Blood, where he mentioned that before the unification, Germany were very much an agricultural nation. I don't know, I use nation to simplify things. Of course, it's you understand what I mean, but German it wasn't a nation by modern sense, but I'm just again I'm using this to simplify terms, but it's used to just mainly 10 years to industrialize its nations in a unified Germany, which going from well, as Peter Wilson argued, that in Britain you almost had a whole century, half a century to get used to industrialization and this process, whereas in Germany you only had 10 years. So let's talk about the industrial process and how companies like Krupp and Thyssen, Essen, in Essen, for example, benefited from the industrial process as well.
Well, okay. This idea that German industrialization was extraordinarily rapid has been criticized for a long time now. It suffice to say that in some of the German sectors of industrialization, it was comparatively rapid, particularly with respect to the British. We're thinking about heavy industry in particular. What happened was that the Industrial Revolution was well underway by the 1850s in Germany. But that what happened in the wake of unification was that it did explode with the expansion of the railway system and the establishment of the steel industry and other heavy metals, the coming of other forms of transportation, so that uh, by the turn of the 20th century, Germany was behind only the United States as the leading industrial producer, particularly of heavy industrial goods in the world. I should say now, when we're talking about liberalism in this regard, that the people who called themselves liberals tended to favor this development and to continue to argue that it would happen best when allowed to function according to its own logic. In other words, the idea of laissez-faire, let it alone, let it develop according to its own logic, was the proper way for industrial development to take place.
Hmm. So how did companies, like I mentioned earlier, such as Krupp and Thyssen, I mean, it's kind of an obvious answer, but how did such companies benefit from the industrialization process?
Well, um, they 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 benefited in insofar as that they were the leading institutional um, proponents of it, or the leading embodiments of it was. The lands that were unified into Imperial Germany in 1871 were extraordinarily well endowed with essential natural resources for industrial development. First and foremost, coal and iron. And what really drove this in the German process was the discovery of how to make practical steel cheaply and in great quantities, so that soon steel, a much more serviceable metal than iron in building all kinds of things, became the fundament of the German Industrial Revolution, or the so-called Second Industrial Revolution of the 1880s, 90s, and early 20th century.
Hmm. Now, another chapter that I found fascinating, and I should say this at the start, but I don't really think there is any book like your book out there, which is really unique and brilliant piece of work, but it's something you because you dedicate not only just about the Prussian elite, but you also talk about the German home. So let's talk about the home world of the German people in a unified Germany.
I'm sorry, the
The
home?
the the German home. You have a chapter, I believe, to the German home as well in the book, if I remember correctly.
Home,
Yeah,
like the house.
yeah, house, home, yeah.
Well, it comes up. There are parts of the book that are devoted to questions of living standards and how people actually did um, survive in Imperial Germany and in their domestic circumstances. The point of the whole exercise was to emphasize the variety of existences uh, that were uh, common in Imperial Germany, and depending on whether you live in the countryside or in the city, whether or not you were endowed with much wealth or not, all of these considerations were extraordinarily important in shaping attitudes of encouraging social contacts and the like. So there was an extraordinary variety of, if you like, domestic life in Imperial Germany. At least that's my recollection of what I was writing
Hmm.
about.
Yeah, actually that's a good idea. Let's talk a little bit about urban and rural living in Imperial Germany as well, how the difference would be between urban and rural Germany.
Well, okay, let's make that one as easy as possible, because the difference between urban and rural Germany revolves about the question of who's producing food.
Hmm.
And the urbanization of Germany meant to say increasing numbers of Germans. And it wasn't too very long before a majority of Germans were living in urban areas of one description or another, and in circumstances that did not allow them to produce their own food. This becomes then one of the central sources of domestic antagonism in Germany, because the cities rely on the countryside to produce their food. The countryside, in turn, argues that in order to be able to feed the population, agricultural prices will have to be kept high enough to guarantee a standard of living to the farmers who were doing it. And one of the really founding acts of the new state was the decision in 1878 made by Bismarck to levy tariffs on imports of cereal grains
Hmm.
into Germany from the rest of the world, which
Now,
basically,
excuse me for interrupting you, but in this, what I found fascinating reading your book, especially about tariffs, and especially when they thinking about living in the 21st century, where a certain president talked about tariffs constantly. Let's talk about German tariffs in the 19th century, like we're about to talk about. And it's just funny. I think had when I read this part, it was really fascinating to read about, and I just couldn't help thinking from a 21st century perspective, where a certain, like I said, where a certain president constantly keep talking, and indeed, as of this moment, has published a list of tariffs on other countries. And let's talk about German tariffs in Imperial Germany.
well, yeah, the parallels between German thinking about tariffs in the late 19th century and American thinking about tariffs in the early 21st display remarkable parallels. But a better place to start is the year 1846,
Mm,
when the same question confronted the British Parliament, which is to say, how are we going to assure a food supply for our people?
mm,
Um, a question that every state has to confront in one way or another, particularly in an era of international competition. What the British did in 1846 was basically to say, we are no longer going to protect the price of cereal grains in the British Isles. What we are going to do is keep our Navy strong enough that we will be able to assure the importation of the food we need to eat. Bismarck faced the same question in 1878, and he answered it quite differently, that we cannot possibly let our agricultural production be at the mercy of other powers. We must make sure that the price of grains is high enough that the farmers can make a living um, farming these grains. Now, the problem was that protecting the agriculture of the country in this way meant to say that not only the price of grain was going to be kept high, but so was the price of food, of bread. The price of bread, food, and by the way, beer was higher in Germany than it was anywhere else in
mm.
Western Europe, and that was a source of much discord in Imperial Germany, and there's no question but that it fed the growth of the German Social Democratic Party.
Now, speaking of prices, you already kind of touched upon this, but I want to talk a little bit more about living standards and price, the salary of workers. And you have several charts in your book as well, where you show, for example, teacher salary or so or a private worker or a public worker salary to compare. So let's talk about the salary of the Germans in Imperial Germany as well, because when we talk about prices of beer as well, I feel that it's also a good time to talk about the income of the German worker.
Yeah, I too thought it was important to do that, but it was primarily within the framework of long-term social developments, which was an acute question and problem in Imperial Germany, because behind the question lurks the specter of Karl Marx
Yeah.
and his disciples, who said that what is going to happen if capitalism proceeds to develop according to its own laws is that class conflict is going to become exacerbated. The rich are going to get richer, and the poor are going to get poorer. The
And again, sorry for interrupting, but it's kind of see a 21st century parallel here. That's kind of exactly what's happening, especially in some countries right now.
Well, yes, this is a story with a very long
Yeah.
history, and I'm only scratching
Yeah.
at the
I
beginning of
just had to get it out there.
But I thought it would be a good idea to look a little more carefully at what the statistics were showing about this question of increasing
Yeah.
polarization, increasing impoverization of the working classes. And the answer turns out to be, well, it's not going as Marx said, that there is evidence to suggest that real wages of most categories of industrial workers were actually improving. That's not to say that these people were wealthy, but they weren't starving and they were not being impoverished. So that the particularly some sectors of industrial laborers, skilled workers, steel workers, and people like that, metal workers, um, had the prospect of making a reasonably comfortable living by the eve of the First World War.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about politics as well, and I want to begin with, and do forgive me if you are not prepared to talk about this, but I want to begin with international relations with Imperial Germany and other countries, because that's something I find fascinating as well, is how did Imperial Germany handle international relations and of say with England, and of course we know they were quite we discussed this last time as well. You were on they were quite friendly with the Ottoman Empire, for example. But let's talk about how Imperial Germany handled international relations.
Well, this is a very complicated story, and probably the quick answer to your question, they didn't handle it very well at all. But what happened in 1871 can be described as a revolution in the international affairs uh, in Europe, with the sudden appearance of the strongest power in Europe right smack in the middle of the continent, where up until 1871 there had been largely a very loose confederation of many, many states. But suddenly, the most formidable military power, as well as the most formidable industrial power in Europe, now emerged as a single powerful state. Now, of Bismarck, one can, I think, safely say that uh, he was a very shrewd international politician, and his great realization, his great claim to diplomatic greatness is that he recognized just how dislocating and how up, what sort of upheaval the unification of Germany meant for other European powers. And he was always careful to protect his own diplomatic achievement by making sure that international rivalries did not reach the breaking point, or that if it were going to come, that his side would always be the stronger in any kind of European conflict. And thus, this very carefully tuned alliance system that he worked out, that he managed to keep the French isolated for most of the era, was a really a very impressive achievement. One that was thrown over almost overnight in the months after Bismarck was chased from power in 1890. William II basically said, "This is nonsense. We are a great power and we should be treated like one, and we're going to become even greater." And so all of the caution, all of the circumspection that had characterized Bismarck's approach to international rivalries was basically thrown aside. And I'm going to editorialize this. If you're looking for a model on which to base Donald Trump, places not to look at Hitler, but at William II, who succeeded Bismarck as the steward of German foreign policy.
Now, let's talk next about, before we go into Wilhelm II, let's begin with Germany under Bismarck and what the Germany under Otto von Bismarck and German politics under Bismarck was like.
Um, in what sense? I mean, I'd say that
Uh,
the
the German political scene and Germany and how, the politics, how Bismarck helped shape the German Empire.
are you talking domestically or internationally now?
Both, both.
Okay. Well, Bismarck recognized, as I said, just how dislocating uh, and how disruptive the birth of the German Empire must have been for the other powers. And his principal concern was to try and stabilize the situation. He was very careful lest it look as if the new German Empire was going to proceed aggressively. Bismarck's entrance, for example, into imperial expansion in the 1880s was very, very cautious and tentative. He never held much by the creation of a German empire, say in Africa or in the Pacific Ocean area. So it was a question of stabilizing the international situation by caution and trying not to make a splash.
Hmm. Now, you mentioned, of course, the African Empire and colonization. Of course, the Great Scramble of Africa was happening in the late 19th century, and of course, Germany, being a new power on the scene, didn't want to fall behind. So let's talk about the German colonies and how Bismarck and his empire. And I'm not going to say Wilhelm first because it was. I'm going to say it was very much Bismarck's empire, and Wilhelm the First was pretty much his puppet in a way. But let's talk about the African adventure under Bismarck and the African colonization and in the Great Scramble of Africa.
Well, it was a curious kind of thing. Bismarck, there's some debate about this, but Bismarck never held very much to the idea of a German colonial empire. He calculated correctly that all of the claims that were being made on behalf of colonial empire, that it would provide um, a great treasury of raw materials and markets and settlement opportunities. Bismarck simply didn't believe it. He might very well have supported um, these arguments for the sake of public relations, but he didn't really believe in it. And he quickly discovered that colonies were costing his government a great deal more than they were bringing in. Um,
If I may, sorry for interrupting you again, but I would actually discussed this with James J. Sheehan a couple of years ago. Well, when we talked about how the colonies only really benefit those companies that produce the, say, boots, weapons, and material you need to keep the colonies intact. It's not really beneficial for the government and the country itself. It's really just those production companies that produce and industrialize the manufactured product you need to keep the empire intact. So it's not, like you said, it's not really very beneficial at all if for the government or the country if the colonies work for in at all.
Well, that is quite correct, but it's also worth saying that there were certainly personal fortunes to be made on the part of some of these plantation societies, but not a single one of them produced a positive dividend in the life of the German colonial empire. So we were saying that the profits were private, but all the costs were socialized.
Yeah. Now, now what's there? Because again, I believe Peter Wilson wrote about this as well in his book, is the Germans have been criticized for poorly governing, and they're kind of appalling for the local indigenous populations in their empire. So, but again, he argues, I believe, if I remember, it's a couple of years ago, so I read this book now, But I believe that his argument wasn't really much worse. The colonies weren't that much worse treated than, say, British or French colonies. So is it fair to criticize the German compared to the British rule in Africa or other French colonies in the African continent? So were German colonies much worse treated than, say, the other empires?
Well, I'm very hesitant to apologize for colonial empire by any of the imperial powers in the late 19th century. Um, there were places in which the Germans um, were particularly bad. And I'm thinking here in particular about the events that surrounded the Southwest African War of 1945 and its aftermath. And one of the things that the Germans did was to take pride in, to announce, to embrace um, terrible, horrible policies that, let's just say, um, other colonial powers preferred to keep quieter. But a couple of generals that were involved in the suppression of the revolts in Southwest Africa actually announced publicly their intention to exterminate every man, woman, and child in the rebelling tribes. Um, something tantamount happened in one way or another in many other colonies, but it was not announced in the newspapers.
Mm.
So the Germans, probably when you come down to it, particularly after the reform of the German colonial administration in the wake of these wars, the Germans, let's just say, were not all that much worse than anybody else, but they were in so many other respects so tactless in how they went about it, so
Mm.
that they set themselves up for the charges that came during the First World War and then were sewn into the Treaty of Versailles settlement after the war, taking the Germans' colonies away, claiming that the Germans had demonstrated that they were not qualified and civilized enough uh, to be a colonial power.
Now, I promise we talked a little bit about, let's go back to Germany, and I promise we talked a little bit about, we talked about religion earlier, and of course, over, and not a huge amount actually from what I remember, but this Judaism was, of course, another religion, and Jews were a part of Germany, and it's always been a part of Germany. So let's talk a little bit about the German Jew in Imperial Germany.
Well, yeah, this is a subject that has drawn an enormous amount of attention for obvious reasons, and it plays an important part, I think, in the story that I'm telling. Um, the thing that first marked out the history of Judaism in the imperial Germany was the triumph of a liberal belief in the emancipation of Jews, which is to say that they would be civilly equal to every other German. And that became a constitutional fact in 1871. And for a number of years, there was much talk about how the Jewish problem was simply going to go away by making them like everybody else. Well, it was, I think I mentioned that in 1873, the so-called Great Depression, which was more like a great 20-year recession, uh, came to Germany and almost immediately provided the occasion for the resuscitation of traditional claims and attacks against the Jews, how they had been singularly responsible for the economic crash of 1870, that 73, that their speculation that their criminal activities were responsible for the economic decline, and it turns out that even though emancipation had been officially enshrined in law, that popular attitudes were much slower to change. And the 1870s then sees the refounding and then remobilization of anti-Semitic sentiments in many parts of Germany. Um, the sorry record of this is that anti-Jewish prejudice of one description or another was very widespread, almost to the point where to it was easier to enumerate who the anti-Semites were than it was to say who wasn't an anti-Semite.
Now, I want
Yeah.
to compare this with, say, Hitler's Germany. So, compare this to the 1930s and the Imperial Germany. How much different was anti-Semitism in between those two eras? Was it, of course, it was probably larger to and degree withheld thanks to Hitler's Germany, but was it that much lower, or was it really not much different at all? It was just more shown publicly in Hitler's Germany. It was about the same level of anti-Semitism.
Well, you mustn't confuse the two. Um, it was it was possible, and it was common for people to voice anti-Semitic prejudices. Uh, Sometimes in what look in retrospect to have been scary terms. You find loud anti-Semites all over the place calling for the abrogation of Jewish civil rights, the reestablishment of all kinds of restrictions on their mobility, their choice of occupations, their ability to teach or to practice occupations. All of this you could see, but the point is, and this is not a small point, uh, before the 1930s, these kinds of measures, advocated or they might have been, were not state policy. When Hitler came to power, that all changed.
So now, conversion, of course, and again, I'm going to compare to Hitler's Germany, wasn't uncommon for the Jews, but of course, we would see in Hitler's Germany that eventually you would have to go 3 generations back to be considered non-Jews. So, which is ludicrous, of course, but how widespread were conversion into, say, Protestantism or Catholicism among Jews and a conversion to Christianity?
Um, Actually, not a lot of conversion at all. We do know that one of the things that I did in the book was to look at the Jewish communities themselves and the way in which Jews associated with among themselves and with other people. And what I found was that in the beginning there was a great deal of attempt on the way on the part of Germany, sorry, a part of German Jews to behave just like Germans. And they joined
Mm.
all kinds of other German clubs. They continued to insist the only difference between them and every other German was their confession, the fact that they went to a synagogue and not to a church. And there was much to support this, but it was not. It was rejected by professional anti-Semites who insisted that Judaism was not simply a confessional question, but it had to do with ethnicity, which is say something deeper. And you find many of these anti-Semitisms going over now to the idea that what distinguishes Jews from Germans were biological racial factors. So you find here in this era of the imperial period, you find the beginnings of an attempt to articulate a systematic, thoroughgoing uh, racist anti-Semitism. And in some parts of the political spectrum, you can document its establishment.
Mm. Now, The next topic I want to talk about is emigration, of course, and at this time, it's not just in Germany, but we don't focus on Germany because it's of course Germany that is the topic of this episode. But emigration to the United States was of course widespread among the European countries to seek the American dream, and of course a better second chance. And what let's talk a little bit about emigration to the United States among Germans and the what percentage of Germans went to the United States to seek a better life for themselves?
I don't have the percentages at the top of my head, but between 1850 or 1840 and 1895, there was something between 4 and 5 million Germans had emigrated, um, mostly to the Western Hemisphere, mostly to North America, either United States or Canada. Include my own great great grandfather as well in that score.
Hmm. Now, it's time to talk about, because we already talked about the Bismarck era, but then let's talk about Wilhelm II's era of government and how things changed from Bismarck until Wilhelm II. And of course, we discussed Wilhelm II in great deal last time, like you said, the last time you were here. But let's talk about, and I don't want to ask, I think I asked you this the last time as well, but so do forgive me if I'm repeating myself. But was it the right choice for Wilhelm II to sack Bismarck when he came to power? And did this, let's talk about the successor of Bismarck and how this would handle the transition from Bismarck's government until Wilhelm's II's government.
I don't believe it's my role in this to judge whether or not William was correct. I think um, let's just say there are a lot of reasons to regret what he did, but there are also a lot of reasons that that made sense of it. Bismarck had become an increasingly unpopular politician on the eve of his own retirement. He had lost his parliamentary majority. He had lost many of his friends. He was becoming a cantankerous, stubborn old man, and probably most faithfully for himself, he was not willing to accede to William II's own pretensions to govern. William II wanted to be his own chancellor. The problem was that he was a foolish man who had no sense of proportion, no sense of empathy for other people, who was mercurially in his sentiments, eccentric, and made many terrible mistakes that made him look probably worse than he was.
Hmm. Now, let's talk about his addition. One of them is, of course, Helmut von Moltke. Sorry if I did say his name wrong, but the junior, not the senior, but was it? It doesn't seem like it seems like historians agree that he wasn't at all what his uncle had been in government, and that Wilhelm II. And I don't remember if it was you or with James T. Sheehan we discussed this, but I remember someone saying that it's was mainly just because the name that Wilhelm II wanted the most in the government, as just because his grandfather had a most in the government, that's the only reason, really the only reason he was there.
Well, the fact that both of the men were named Moltke, Helmut von Moltke, was actually an important part of the story. That the career of the younger Moltke was certainly
A less
very
talented Moltke, if you will.
well. That yeah, but in this case, it was a direct relationship, and there's no question but that um, the younger Moltke was preferred at several stages in his career, in promotions up the ladder, by his name and his association with the great hero of the wars of unification. And that fact, the prestige that accrued to him by virtue of his name alone certainly was one of the reasons why William II in 1905 uh, chose him to be Stephen's successor.
Mm.
Wait a minute,
No,
just
no, yeah.
hold.
No, sorry about that, but
Oh,
yeah, let's talk about. I think it's time to talk about the German army and the German navy, of course, because as historians state, this the navy very much would be the second only to Britain, but let's talk about a little bit about this because what I find think when it comes to the navy, because the British, of course, was on an island compared to Germany. I think it's also while numbers is well and good, but I think we need to think experience in this as well. So while they had great numbers, of course, well, I don't think it's really fair to compare to the British because they had much more experience than in naval warfare than say the Germans. But let's talk a little bit about both the British Army and, of course, the German Navy. Sorry, the German Army and the German Navy as well.
okay. What should we say about it?
Well, what do you want to say? I mean, you wrote it's your book, so well, I suppose you know what to say.
Okay. I don't know of many historians who think that the German decision uh, to build a navy capable of challenging the Royal Navy in a major sea battle was a particularly good idea. The Germans lacked the resources uh, to do it. Uh, they also um, misunderstood the kinds of calculations that would drive the British to resist the German um, armament under practically any kinds of circumstances. In other words, it was both strategically and politically a really enormously ill-informed and ill-considered decision to do it. But
Mm,
it has to be said that it was an undertaking that was enormously popular in the German middle classes.
mm. So, of course, when it comes to the First World War, what was it the right choice in the long run to build the German Navy when it comes to the First World War as well? Because, of course, as we know, the German U-boats would really use the Atlantic and they will take advantage of. They had the biggest, I believe, one of the biggest submarine fleet in the world at the time. So, what was it in the long run? Of course, well, it wasn't a great idea, as you said. Was it kind of the right choice in when it came to at least to the Great War in 1914 to 1918?
All right, here I'll bite. No, it was a terrible choice. It was just it got them nothing.
But what about the army then? Because of course, like we know, the Prussians at least had a great military history, dating at least back to Frederick II and further, maybe even further beyond. So what about the German army and how they militarized the country? Because as the famous saying goes, Prussia was a army with a nation, not a nation with an army, I believe. So let's talk about how the German army and like you said, it was a terrible choice with Navy, but what about the German army then?
Well, okay, look. Um, as historians, we have the enormous benefit of hindsight,
Yeah.
and we didn't. And this goes with respect to both the Army and the Navy, except that I'm in a position where I can say there are lots and lots and lots of people in Germany too who were saying that this naval competition with Great Britain is not a very good idea. Um, now, there are there are reasons to believe that the German army made miscalculations almost as spectacular as the naval staff when planning for the First World War. My friend Stieg Forster has just published a huge military history of Germany, in which he makes quite clear his belief that the German strategic thinking about the First World War, particularly how the German army should fight it, that this was just boneheaded. There were all kinds of reasons to suspect that this wasn't going to work. So he knows more about it than I, but I'm quite comfortable in endorsing his view about it.
Hmm. So let's talk about the Great War then, or First World War, if you prefer. And let's talk about the Germany and the no, sorry, not Axis, but Central
No powers.
Alliance, Central Powers. Sorry, and a bit. It's easy to mix those two. But let's talk about the Germany in the Great War as and how this would be the fall.
Okay,
And was there any chance that Germany would actually win the war in the First World War at all? And it's easy to compare, say, the Second World War. There's so many theories but we know now, of course, again in hindsight, that they had no chance in winning the Second World War. But the First World War, I believe, was of course different. So was there any chance at all that Germany could have won? And let's talk about Germany and the fall, how the Great War would
yeah,
bring down the downfall of the German Empire.
okay. Um, there's another book that you might know, and it's certainly um, really relevant to the question, and it's by another friend of mine. This one who teaches in Leeds in Britain. His name is Holger Afflerbach. I don't know whether you know.
I haven't
Uh,
heard that name, no.
it's called On the Knife's Edge. It's available in English. And he argues that the decision in the First World War was always on the knife's edge from start to finish, and that there are any number of scenarios that he can envisage in which the Germans would win. Um, Starting with the success of the Schlieffen Plan, which could then be in turn disarticulated into this decision or that decision, and this all throughout the war. My own view on it, and he and I have discussed this at some length, is rather different. I believe that once the Schlieffen Plan did fail to achieve victory in the West, and of course, there are lots of reasons why this happened. But once it did happen, I think that in the end, the Germans were going to lose the war for reasons that Schlieffen himself had foreseen. The reason why the German troops made this colossal gamble on the strategic development in 1914 was that they figured that if they were going to win the war at all, they had to win it quickly. And when they failed to win it quickly, they found themselves in a war that they couldn't win. It was something that Moltke's successor, Falkenhayn, realized himself in November of 1914 and admitted as much to the civilian leadership. And the civilian leadership said, that's nonsense. Of course, we're going to win it. And so on it went. But the plain fact of the matter is, the longer the war went on, the greater the German disadvantage became, until with the United States arrival as an active belligerent in the spring of 1917, the Germans found themselves at war with practically the entire rest of the planet.
Now, let's talk about the end of the final days of the German Empire and the fall and the start of the Weimar Republic.
Well, um, the the last great gamble of the German army came in the spring of 1918 with the offensives that are associated with the name of Ludendorff. And when those failed, and there was little doubt that they would fail in the end, the German war effort was even in the eyes of the General Staff itself, was no longer a workable thing. With the result that the peace process began, or the peace negotiations began in September 1918, when Hindenburg and Ludendorff announced to the Kaiser that you must negotiate for an immediate armistice. And at that point, the cat was out of the bag, and it was a question of negotiating what would be for the Germans the most favorable kind of armistice that they could ever hope, which would have been one that would have allowed them to keep their army in place and with its present armaments. But the Americans would not fall for that, and Wilson insisted on a much more stringent armistice, calling for an immediate withdrawal of Germans from their positions and the handing over of their heavy weaponry.
Hmm. So, what would you say is the legacy of the German Empire? And I'm going to ask you as well because I asked James again. I'm referring to him a few times, but I would highly recommend checking out our episode on the Prussian called the Prussian Empire. But we talked about this with James J. Sheehan as well, so I'm sure you know. Where is it fair to say there are a of course, we're looking for again, like you said, we're looking from this as in hindsight. Is it fair to draw direct lines from the German Empire to the rise of Hitler, or was it inevitable in a way that Hitler's rise to power? Because I don't personally think it is, but do you think it's? What are your thoughts that some historians, and I think it's more the older generation, that draw a direct line from the German foundation of the German Empire until the rise of Hitler, that it was an inevitable line. But what are your thoughts on the legacy of the German Empire and the rise of Hitler, that it was inevitable?
Well, there is a brief conclusion in that book entitled Afterlife,
Mm.
in which I play with one possible answer to that question. Nowhere am I willing to argue that what happened after 1919 and before 1933 was inevitable. There are just too many places here where you could say that if this had gone that way, the Weimar Republic would have survived. There were lots and lots and lots of mistakes that were made all along the line, any one of which could have resulted in a different situation. The one that I play with here is the one that actually did happen, and there is a way of painting it to draw a rather direct line between the fall of the Weimar Republic and should say, the persistence of the German Empire. And this has to do largely with the role of the German army, the continued role of the German army in Weimar politics. And I'm speaking especially now the election in 1925 of Marshal von Hindenburg to be the president of the German Republic. And
And as well, sorry for interrupting you, Jan, but I want to point out as well that the German politicians are as well kind of somewhat to blame because they are the ones who in 1919 said, "Oh, we were stabbed in the back," and that's the home front, and these. And not that everyone said this, of course, but some blame the Jews as well for losing the war, and that's what Hitler built on. The idea that the politicians who started this, that the idea that we were stabbed in the back, and that's why we lost the war, and that's why morale was so low in the German army by 1918, that that's why we lost the war.
well, okay, that's not why they lost the war.
We
Uh,
know that, of course, now, but that's politicians in Germany, of course, like to claim that we know, of course, but the politicians had to use a scapegoat and say that that it's not our fault that we lost the war, it's that we were stabbed in the back, that's why we lost the war. You know what I mean?
yeah, but you need to shift the question. because the question is not so much whether the German army was stabbed in the back, because it wasn't. The question is, why was this view
Yeah.
of the back? Why was it credible, and why was it believed? And it certainly had something to do with the election of Paul von Hindenburg to be president of the Republic in 1925. My my own reasoning at this point, and it becomes kind of perverse, but it's something that I like to point out, is that um, with the worsening of the depression after 1929, the result was a kind of political paralysis in Berlin where no parliamentary majority of any kind was conceivable. So that what happens, in fact, is that the parliament is impotent. It's more or less no longer a factor, which turns Paul von Hindenburg into, I mean, given the pertinent clauses in the Weimar Constitution, turns Paul von Hindenburg into what I like to call an Ersatz Kaiser, which is to say that he winds up in the political system of the late Weimar Republic that looks a lot like the position of William II in the German Empire, to the point where the most politically relevant things that are going on are in the vicinity, in the offices of Paul von Hindenburg. And within this scenario, within this chamber around Hindenburg, the negotiations take place among the presidential advisors, who almost to a man are people who grew up politically in the German Empire. They recommend to Hindenburg that he appoint Hitler chancellor. And I end the book by saying, in this fashion, the empire struck back.
I think we're gonna round it up there. Thank you so much for coming. It's been a great pleasure to have you back again. You're always welcome back to the podcast, of course. Before you go, if people have further questions about the German Empire or Wilhelm II, I would highly recommend to check out that episode as well. So, of course, where can people find you if you are online? And of course, where can people buy your book? I'm sorry for the virtual background, it's kind of disrupting, but I'm trying to hold up the book here, German
I
Empire, the
understand.
1918 sorry, 1871 to 1918. Thank you so much for sending me this copy. I really, really enjoyed it. And of course, where can people buy the book? Do you have anything else you want to promote? Any other work you want to share that is relevant to our discussion? Now is your chance to share your work.
Well, yeah, thank you very much. I've spent most of my life working on the German Empire in one way or another. The book is on sale. I do have a website, and I stand at disposal.
Thank you so much again for coming. This has been With That Aged Well. We are available on Twitter/X, and then With That Aged Well. I'll try to get off it right now because it's more because of Elon propaganda, but we are also on Blue Sky. I try to post more there on the But Not Aged Well Instagram, But Not Aged Well. We are on Instagram. Yep, I think I said that already. But we are on. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you're on Spotify, consider giving us 5 stars, or if you hate this podcast, you can always give us one. At least in my world, it's a free world for now, so you do whatever you want. If you are on Apple Podcasts, you can write us a nice review. That would be very nice. If you are on YouTube, like, share, subscribe. But you can also leave a comment on Spotify if you like this episode. So leave a comment what you think about the German Empire, what you thought about our discussion. If you are on YouTube, of course, you can also leave a comment. Check out some other episodes that we made. We should have definitely some episodes that you like. And of course, check out our episode where we discuss Wilhelm II in greater detail. Thank you so much for coming again for the third time. This has been With That Aged Well. My name is Alan, and I'll see you next time.